This little lady needs a skirt, so I thought that's what we would do today. This is a Lammily doll, and she is fundamentally the same size as a Curvy Barbie. So the skirt we're going to knit, you can knit for either girl. I have started out with some waste yarn. You do not have to do it, but I'm using my old Corona today, and I haven't used it in a while. So I did this to make sure that all was well before setting up to work with you. And I have got her feet disturbing the needle, so I'll have to straighten out that before I go. No big deal. So what we have is 50 stitches. You may either E-wrap them directly or do what I did here and begin on waste yarn, and then we'll knit a row of ravel cord. Here's what I use for ravel cord. It's strong and thin. This was a bargain cone, a very strong, slippery, thin yarn from the thrift store. Originally, many machines came with something similar, usually a little bit thicker than this, for you to use. Much of it is lost in the mists of time now, and while you can buy new official ravel cord, substitutes like this work very well. For the skirt, I'm going to use this odd and end of Yeoman Cashmelon. Any yarn that can be adjusted to get about 7 stitches, 10 rows per inch may be used. You don't have to be overly finicky here because slight gauge differences are minimized by the fact that we're only knitting a 7-inch width of fabric. If you were knitting an adult sweater, the gauge difference could result in 2 or 3 inches of difference in sweater size if you got, say, 7.2 stitches per inch versus 7. But for this little skirt, get close and you'll probably be okay. Plus, if you should make a mistake, knitting another 50-stitch skirt is not exactly exhausting. I'm not positive I have enough of this fuchsia left. We'll see. We can always add stripes if not. My ravel cord is all threaded in the carriage in the normal way, and because I had my needles disarranged, I brought them all forward so that it'll knit back from hold position, and I'll just knit across. It's in there. It's hard for you to see, but now I'm going to snip this end and just leave it dangling. Now I'm more comfortable E-wrapping from left to right, so what I'm going to do is shift this into the position that will allow me to get a free pass with the needles in hold. I did have it on number 2, which allows them to knit back from hold, and on this machine, number 1 will get me a free pass. I want to be sure that you understand all standard gauge machines can be used for this, and all have a similar setting to what I just used. It may vary what it's called and exactly where your lever is placed, but they've all got it. E-wrap is easiest to begin by hanging a hook on the leftmost needle. And from here, we'll just go across, making the letter E gently around each needle. Normally I do this with 2 hands. In this case, I'm having to hold the camera with 1. When I'm able to use 2, I put my index finger of the non-wrapping hand on top of the needles to keep them in position so that what just happened does not happen, and to keep those loops on, and it goes very fast across. But you know how to E-wrap, I'm sure, and I have other whole movies on doing it, so I'm going to finish the rest off camera. My E-wraps are complete, and the main yarn is threaded into the carriage. This carriage is a bit unusual if you are used to a brother or a studio, but it's basically working the same way. So I've got my stitch size set at 7, which is pretty classic for this size of yarn. All the settings are for stockinette, and on this side I have it set to knit back from hold because that's where I am now. Neatening up. And I would like to make a point that if you're knitting on a passet, this pattern does work, but you will want to have done double E-wraps here so as to get a true stitch in every needle and every needle back to normal working position, and then N and black strippers for this next part. What we're going to do is just knit 20 rows. There's my 20. Everything looks good. Now you can see my row of ravel cord. Conveniently, it is a very different color from the yarns above and below, making them easy to spot. And what I'm going to do is find my E-wraps and hang each E-wrap from the initial cast on the needle just above it. E-wrap, lift it, put it on the needle by rotating up. It's simple, you just have to take your time. Make sure you get the very bottom yarn loop, and that is the correct one. And we'll work all the way across in that manner. Here we are. This is what it looks like all hung, and you can see that your ravel cord becomes a bit more prominent. Now I'm going to push all of my needles back to hold and let them knit back from hold. There's a reason behind this. When I push them through the hung stitches, I've done half of the work. The carriage only has to draw them back the other way. And that's important to me because I've made more work for the carriage by having 2 sets of loops of yarn, the original stitch plus what I hung, on each needle. So to avoid drop stitches and problems, this is a step that costs very little and helps a great deal. One other thing, it can also help to, for this one row only, go up a stitch size. This is because the stitch will be tighter because it's filled with these 2 loops rather than 1. So to keep it from making an undue bump, this can be a help. And you can feel the stiffness as you knit it, but it looks like it knitted just beautifully. So now we'll reduce the stitch size and go back to normal knitting. At this point, it just becomes straight knitting for as many rows as you want the skirt to be long. I can see that I am not going to have enough of my pink, so it's time to start making some stripes or something. Let's go ahead and use some black. I've decided to make a wide black stripe roughly equal to the amount of pink I've already got. Now time to put my pink back in the carriage. Now measuring my actual length of the knitting, remember it goes to the bottom of the first pink section, against the doll, I actually think I'm going to have enough from this point if I simply end in pink, do the waistband in pink, and then I'm probably going to use this area to do a small amount of embroidery and really jazz it up for about 10 minutes of work. So I'm going to keep knitting in pink until I just have enough to bind off with, and I'll see you then because there's a special technique we're going to use before binding off. All right, starting in the center front, the seam will be in the center back. I'm going to transfer stitches every so often, creating eyelets. I'm still holding the camera, so doing this one-handed is a little exciting. That's fine. And 1, 2, 3, I think every 5th one will be okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches left alone. Transfer the 5th one, and I'll work out from the center all the way across. This is a doll skirt, so we're not going to worry about whether we come out with the perfect number of leftover needles at each end. We'll just make a row of eyelets on every 5th needle. Okay, see the empty needles? Let's see. There's one. There's one. There's one. These are where the eyelets will occur. And now we're going to bind off normally. If my machine had gate pegs, I would bind off around the gate pegs. Since it does not, I'll use the transfer bind off. That looks good. Transfer bind off goes like this. Pick up the edge stitch, transfer it to the next needle over. You will have some needles that were empty, as I just did, but we're going to bind them off anyway, which finishes the eyelets. Obviously, you've got to keep the latch open, and mine just popped shut, in order to make a bind off. What we're doing is we're transferring and then manually making a new stitch onto the next needle over, yarn in the hook, pull back, a new stitch was created. Pick up that stitch, move it to the next needle, pull forward, open the latch, pull back. You can get quite fast at this, and you can learn to do it without a tool at all. The secret of the no tool method is grab just below the stitch so it cannot pull out, and then tighten it up before you create the new one. Transfer, tighten, new stitch, and on across like that. Here's the doll, and here's the skirt. So you can see I've got plenty of length. Time to get this waste yarn off. If you didn't use waste yarn, then just skip this step. I should be able to pull from one end and have it just release from the other side. This is the ravel cord I'm pulling out. You can probably hear it slipping and see it gathering. And there's my nice, neat hem edge. The hem never looks as nice until you do this, as nice as it can, that is. My real preferred way is to slide a knitting needle inside it and give it a sharp tug down, but it's hard to show you that on the camera. So, you should see a row of tiny eyelets up here, which we will use to weave our waistband through. It's just going to be a drawstring. But first, we need to sew this back seam. You may sew using any method you like. It's really not that critical, but I'll show you one real quick. I like to use the yarn tails, especially when I've used stripes, because then I have the correct color already handy. And to plan ahead for that, of course, make sure you leave long enough yarn tails. What I'm doing here is back stitching. I come up a short distance away from the last thing that I did. And this is easier to do with a true yarn needle, but what I found first was this double eye needle, so I'm using it. Up, then here's why it's called back stitch. Back, a tiny bit farther into the work. Up, a little bit away from the last time, and we're trying to work right next to the very last column of stitches. I don't work into it, I work next to it. Opinions vary on that, and the appropriate place actually varies a little bit by project and gauge, but for a doll skirt it's just not critical enough to worry about. Do what works for you. So I'm going to finish seaming, you finish seaming, and then we'll go on. Now we need a drawstring to go through those eyelets. And I'm out of my pink yarn, and you won't be able to see very well if I use my black yarn. So I'm using a second pink yarn. And we're just going to crochet a chain. Latch tool or crochet hook, doesn't matter. I think 16 inches is about the minimum chain length to get it through those eyelets and tied into a bow, which is what we're going to need to do. So just crochet till you've got that. Of course, if you want to tie a fancy bow or do things a little bit differently, you may vary your length. I fooled around a little bit and decided to do a row of chain stitched X's to embellish the skirt. It's kind of the simplest possible thing. Begin with a knotted loop as usual. The advantage of using chain stitch embroidery on a knitted skirt is that chain stitch retains some stretch. And even though this is a doll, we will have to pull it on over her hips. So I'm going to try to position my X's roughly equidistant
Hasn't got to be perfect, but I've got 1, 2, 3 stitches between those two. 1, 2, 3. So I will go down right there and pull my first loop up from the back. And now 3 diagonal stitches, always pulling your yarn through from inside to outside. You may embroider anything you want or nothing at all, or use a piece of lace, or do another kind of embroidery. My point in doing this was to keep it simple. Now when I've done my 3 stitches, I'm going to pull this loop through to the front and then grab it and pull it through to the back. I wanted to keep it simple. I wanted to tie my colors together, and I wanted to use a technique that anybody could learn so that if you've never done embroidery before, it's not a deal breaker. Now the other half of my X, starting about there. One nice thing about this is should you make a mistake, it just pulls out. And you can do it again. Other cool things you can do are little bits of lace as mentioned, glue-on sequins. Fabric glue actually does a very nice job of embellishing doll clothes. Not fabric glue, fabric paint, sorry about that. And there is my last X. Looks okay to me. I have found that getting too finicky about it just causes you needless stress. And if you think you hate it, but you're too tired to go on, come back to it later and see if you do, because sometimes it looks cute to you later, even though at first it upsets you. I'll tie off to the inside. The inside is ugly, but nobody is going to see it. The doll won't even notice because she's a doll. And now this should still stretch enough to go over her hips easily. So now it's time to install our drawstring. And we start that at the center front. And I can use my center X as a guide because I made it in the center front. Now my double eye needle is great for this. I'll need to find, there's the closest eyelet. Up, should be 5 stitches away, and there it is, down. Up, down, up. I know that across the back is not going to be a perfectly spaced eyelet. We already talked about that. But that's good enough. And in actual fact, you can fudge and shove it right through the edge. But I do have real eyelets right underneath the bind off. That's just what we plan to do. Okay, and here it is, basically finished. Let's get it on the doll, see how she likes it. And here's how I adjust the length of these once they're finished to give them a nice solid end, not worry about raveling and get them just how I want them. Just knot and snip. It's not really likely to come apart. I had that little extra piece of thread in there. So that one's already knotted. I just need to snip. And here we go. A quick note for you. We're getting about 10 stitches per inch in this kind of yarn most of the time. And I did get that. There were 20 rows involved in the hem, but only half of them are on the outside, so that's 1 inch. And these combined, before I bound off, were another 30 rows. So I got 4 inches of skirt, and that's, as you see, hits her just above knee length. If you want a mini skirt, you would want to go at least 10 rows shorter. If you want a dressy length skirt, you would need to go, it looks like about 3 inches longer to me to get a full length skirt. So that would be 30 more rows. And of course it will vary with the specifics of your yarn a little bit, but that's basically what you're looking at.
Very easy and very cute.